There's a photograph in The Color of Law, an example of a subdivision that was built in Detroit that the developer was required by the Federal Housing Administration to build a wall that was 6 feet high, half a mile long, to separate the subdivision that this developer was building for whites from a nearby African-American neighborhood. It was required to build this wall in order to get the federal subsidies to build the white neighborhood. This is how interested the government was in keeping races separate. So we have this understanding in this country, an explanation we've accepted to explain why our cities, neighborhoods are racially segregated. Metropolitan areas all over the country are segregated by race, particularly the separation and segregation of whites and African Americans. It's persistent all over the country, and we tell ourselves, as a country, as a nation, that the reason for that is what's called de facto segregation. It wasn't caused by laws or policies, but it was caused by maybe private actors, bigoted landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers who refused to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods, just, on their own account. Or that it was because of personal preferences. We like to live around people who look like us, so we self-sort into same race neighborhoods. And when we believe that, we believe that, we might think it's too bad that we're so racially segregated, but something that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. It's sort of a magical occurrence. We don't have any agency or any obligation to do anything about it. So The Color of Law, which my dad wrote in 2017, took on this idea of de facto segregation and called it an utter myth. He said, sure, private actors had a role to play in creating segregated communities, but their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by government policies, all levels of government, local government, state government, federal government, that required that as we created communities, we created them on a segregated basis, and required that we segregated already racially integrated communities and made them racially segregated. So once we reckon with this history, we can see that the government had the government is the reason our communities are racially segregated. And those actions that the government has taken to create segregation are violations of the Constitution. Those actions were unconstitutional, violations of the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And as such, when we reckon with that history and see that our government has broken its own laws to do this, we can start to see that we have an obligation to do something about it. And not only an obligation, but we now have agency. We can see that this was intentional action that created segregation, so intentional action can challenge and undo it. So The Color of Law was a wake-up call for the country to reckon with the true history of how we came to be a segregated country. And it really changed the conversation around the nation around this. We hear a lot more about redlining, about restrictive covenants, about all of the policies that created segregation, whereas before, even though it was explicit policy at the time, we have since kind of forgotten how it happened and told ourselves it was just kind of a magical occurrence that we came to live in segregated communities. So The Color of Law really woke up the country to the true causes of segregation and sets us up to be able to do something about it. When we talk about segregation, we're not talking about just a benign separation of people where some people live here and some people live here and all else is equal. We're talking about the separation and segregation of people that go hand in hand with the separation and segregation of resources. Where as communities were segregated by race, the same policies ensured that communities where whites were subsidized to live, allowed to live, helped to live in, those communities saw a lot of resources, access to opportunities, a lot of investments. They tend to be what are called high opportunity communities. These are communities with well-resourced public schools and public services, clean air, open space, access to jobs and transportation. And then those same policies that created those white communities created segregated African American communities that were deprived of the same access to resources and opportunity. Those segregated African American communities more likely to be zoned to be near industrial land uses, for example, or near freeways. or on land that used to be industrial use. And so there's more toxins in the soil, more toxins in the air. The buildings are older, so more likely to have lead paint. All of this contributes to a neighborhood where everybody's living with all these environmental hazards. And so they have more health impacts of that, and it leads to very serious health disparities between blacks and whites in this country that come down to the neighborhoods we live in. So I wouldn't say anything about that as benign. There are very serious consequences to segregation. So local governments, cities, counties, can have the authority to zone land uses in their jurisdiction. They can say commercial uses here, industrial uses here, residential uses here. And it used to be that cities would zone their residential areas by race. They could, written into their zoning codes, would say this residential area is a white residential area, this residential area is a non-white or African American residential area. So that's a pretty clear line between segregation and zoning. Now, at some point in the early 20th century, that was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said cities can no longer zone by race. And so instead, many of them, wanting to maintain those same racial boundaries, zoned the white areas for single-family only use, which means that you can only build one house per lot in those areas. And then they would zone the areas that were zoned previously for African Americans to allow multifamily use, mixed use, commercial, industrial uses. So that in and of itself created different outcomes, different access to resources in those two areas. Restrictive covenants were popular from the 20s on all over the country. In the 40s, when the Federal Housing Administration was financing suburbs, we can see it written into government policy, into the FHA manual for appraisers. So appraisers who worked for the Federal Housing Administration went around the country to appraise proposed developments of suburbs and subdivisions to decide if it was a good candidate for investment or subsidy by the federal government. So the appraisers had a handbook that told them, how to assess if this proposed development was worthy of federal subsidy. And it was written into that manual that any subdivision that was even located near where African Americans lived was not worthy of subsidy because it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So this manual ensured, it was, codified in federal practice and policy, that it would only subsidize developments that segregated races and included these racially restrictive covenants. Zoning restrictive covenants did a very effective job of segregating the races in metropolitan areas all over the country, but that wasn't enough. They weren't done. There were still many more policies that were enacted to ensure that segregation was entrenched and maintained and sustained for a long period of time. Redlining is another policy that was enacted by government agencies to ensure the segregation of neighborhoods. And how redlining worked was the federal government created maps of neighborhoods. This started in the 30s when the Federal Housing Administration started to offer mortgages to homeowners who were at risk of foreclosure. Because of the Great Depression, they weren't able to pay their mortgages. This is when the 30-year fixed mortgage started, and that was to help homeowners be able to maintain their mortgages and stay in their homes by refinancing through a federally backed mortgage. Now, in order to decide which homeowners were eligible for that federally backed mortgage, the government made maps of cities all over the country that determined which neighborhoods were considered high enough quality to be able to be eligible, those homeowners in that neighborhood eligible for a mortgage backed by the federal government, and which neighborhoods were too low quality to be able to access a federally backed mortgage. Now, how those assessments, those neighborhood grading was done was often by the race of the people who lived in those neighborhoods. Areas that were exclusively white were the highest rating. They were green that you see on redlining maps. Areas that were mostly African American or other non-white races were red on the maps. That's why we call it redlining. red areas, red-lined areas, were not eligible. They couldn't access mortgages because it was deemed too risky because those neighborhoods were too low quality. So this policy of the federal government in the mid-20th century is a main driver, main cause of the huge racial wealth gap we have today. And so, an ongoing consequence that can't be fixed with only forward-looking policies is the wealth gap between whites and blacks. So we, have the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 that says you can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing. Those racially restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable. But, it doesn't do anything to address the wealth disparity that is a result of these past government policies. And as a result of that wealth disparity, it underlies a lot of the other racial disparities in our country. So it's I would say, a moral imperative of all of us in this country to address these disparities so that every child can have access to long, healthy lives no matter which neighborhood they live in. Well, so we wrote Just Action to try to answer the question of what can we do about this now? A lot of people read The Color of Law. A lot of people have started to understand how we came to be a segregated country, but it doesn't mean, understanding how we got here doesn't mean we understand how to get out of it. And so we wanted to write this book to show that there's so much that we can do to challenge segregation, and so much that's possible and so much that's already being done that our only excuse now is that we have to get started on implementing these strategies. So what we argue in Just Action is that we have to live up to our obligation to remedy and redress segregation. And when I say redress, I mean both change the laws and policies that continue to maintain and perpetuate segregation, and also provide remedies and redress for the ongoing harms of past government policies that created segregation. We have to do both of those things. And so what we argue is that in order to do this, we need a reactivated, newly invigorated civil rights movement ready to take on residential segregation head on. The civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s made a lot of gains in racial equality, but left residential segregation virtually untouched. Part of the reason is because it's very difficult. It feels almost impossible to change these very entrenched patterns. But we wanted to show that it's not actually that impossible. And so we focus on local policies that locally organized groups of residents can pursue in their own communities that go a long way towards challenging segregation. And even though the federal government was a major player in creating segregated communities, once created, to a large extent, that segregation is maintained and perpetuated, sustained by local policies. So there's a lot we can do locally that can challenge those patterns in our own communities. So even though the federal government was one of the primary driver of creating segregation, once segregation is established in a community, to a large extent, it is perpetuated and maintained by local policy. Zoning policy, for example, affordable housing development policies, community land trusts, the policies of the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program that are determined locally. There's all sorts of policies, programs, strategies that we can focus on locally that go a long way towards challenging segregation and remediating, providing remedies for its ongoing harms. I think it's the National Association of Realtors, it's the local real estate associations, and it's individual realtors. There's maybe the national and the larger real estate agencies who have direct ties to the past practices of real estate agents in creating segregation and discriminating in housing access, have an obligation to remedy those acts. But today, realtors in practice today, whether or not they, come from a line of realtors in their family or not, they have a role to play today in ensuring that they're implementing the Fair Housing Act and adhering to it the way that they should, and that is not happening all over the country. So Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Cast, she uses a metaphor that says, when you buy a house with a cracked foundation, you don't go into it and say, oh, I didn't crack the foundation, I'm not going to fix it. We all have an obligation to fix what has been broken before us, even if we weren't directly to blame for fixing it. If we want to live in a stable home, a stable community, a stable country, we have to fix those broken promises, the harms, the crimes of the past in order to actually create that stability and health of our communities. So in this country, we have adopted this narrative that it's all individual choice, it's all individual agency, that we decide where we live, that if I want to live in this community and I do live there and it's a nice, affluent community, it must be because I am special or I'm especially hardworking. And if I, end up living in a community that's lower income, that has, not as nice resources, it's because of a personal fault or failing on my part. Now, that narrative helps keep us in the state that we're in, which is that if it's a personal failing, then I just have to try harder. And if I try harder, I'll be able to achieve what other people are able to achieve. And it doesn't allow us to look at the systemic structural issues that really create the disparities and the segregation of our country. It's not an accident, and it's not a personal victory on the part of people, white families who live in affluent suburbs, that they get to live there. It was purposefully designed that way to ensure that suburb was exclusively created and sustained to be only for white families. Similarly, for African Americans stuck in lower income communities, it's not a personal failing on their part that their communities look the way they do and that they can't get out of those communities to live elsewhere if they want to. It is a structural, policy issue that has ensured that is how their communities look and that they don't have access to leaving their community if they want to. So I think it's really important that we really start to understand the history, because it starts to break down this narrative that it's all, on us personally to determine where we live and what our communities look like. It was actually a grand design of this country to make it look the way it does. And once we understand that, I think it does give us some agency back, because if it was designed this way and it's not just about my own personal failings or how good I am as an individual, then we can start to see what we can do together to change it. As long as we're racially separate, we can have excuses to not fund communities equally. If we're segregated and polarized and we don't see commonalities between the races, then it's a lot easier to vote against policies that we see as helping another race. So it's a way of dividing the country, it's a way of perpetuating this belief that we are fundamentally different and that we don't have the same interests at heart. And once that can happen, it's a lot easier to create policies that only benefit a small group. I think the motivations were around just keeping us divided and keeping all of us down, because it really does hurt everybody. It depresses the growth of the country by perpetuating segregation. It hurts people's life chances and life outcomes. It creates these racial disparities that, as a country, we all have to then reckon with and deal with. Yeah, the segregation of our neighborhoods is deeply entrenched in this country. Decades of policies and practices went into creating the way our neighborhoods look today. So it's easy to look around and think, oh, this is just how America looks. This is what our neighborhoods look like. We can't change it. It's too complicated, it's too entrenched, or it's too, by accident. It just sort of happened by accident. But even though what went into creating the entrenched segregation we see today was very powerful, those policies were very powerful, we can undo it through purposeful action and policies to counteract that segregation.